at the throat of the Strait of Hormuz, where inbound and outbound tankers squeeze through shipping lanes only a few miles wide. Captain staring across the black water saw the crisis unfold in two directions. To the north, fast Iranian attack craft were peeling out from hidden inlets and fishing harbors. Above them, over the ridgelines, hundreds of parachutes opened, then hundreds more, until the sky looked crowded with white canopies. 3,000 American airborne troops were dropping into the Hormuz battle space, while U.S. warships drove toward the choke point, because the window to keep that passage open was already closing, and if the strait locked up for even a day, the shock would not stop at the waterline. This was not a symbolic show of force. It was a race for control over the narrowest maritime artery that matters to the world economy. Nearly a fifth of globally traded oil moves through Hormuz, and the geography makes that traffic brutally vulnerable. The strait narrows to roughly 21 miles at its tightest point, but the actual traffic separation lanes are far smaller than the map suggests. There is barely enough room for giant tankers to keep distance and avoid collision. Add sea clutter, coastal radars, missile batteries hidden in rock, drone feeds, and swarms of fast boats carrying rockets or mines, and the entire waterway becomes a kill box. That is why every signal in the Gulf had turned urgent. Commercial traffic had already slowed. Insurers were raising rates. One tanker had reported an explosion off its bow. Another had gone dark after a drone shadowed it through the outbound lane. U.S. patrol aircraft had tracked unusual boat traffic moving at night from Iranian-held coves toward the shipping corridor. Satellite passes showed mobile anti-ship launchers dispersing across Qashm and Larak, the islands overlooking the transit route. Tehran did not need to sink a fleet to create a crisis. It only had to make captains believe the next transit might be their last. Wait too long, and the first mine strike or missile hit would shut commercial movement down on its own. Strike too hard, and a containment mission could become a regional war before dawn. The Navy had to keep sea lines open, protect civilian shipping, and blunt Iran's layered threat without stumbling into a blind escalation. Fleet commanders needed clean lanes, protected hulls, and a legal basis for every shot fired. And the men on the bridges of destroyers and tankers needed something more immediate, enough time to survive the next radar contact. The response window was measured in hours, not days. Once mines are seeded into a transit lane, the effect is immediate even before the first detonation. Once mobile cruise missile teams displace into prepared firing points, they can shoot and relocate before aircraft finish their first run. Once fast boats disappear into coastal clutter, every fishing hull becomes a question mark. Hormuz punishes hesitation because the defender is protecting movement, while the attacker only has to introduce doubt. The United States could not defend every mile of the Gulf, so it moved to dominate the narrow gate where all consequences converged. That was the logic behind the airborne drop. The troops were not dropping into open water. They were dropping onto key ground around the southern side of the choke point and onto landing zones that overlooked the approach geometry of the strait. The first wave was light and fast, pathfinders, airborne infantry, communications teams, counter-drone specialists, forward observers, and security elements tasked with grabbing high ridgelines, isolated strips, and coastal observation points before Iranian planners could widen the battle. Once those parachutes opened, the mission was clear. Build a shield over the shipping lane from the landward side. Give the Navy eyes on every inlet, cliff road, and launch point that mattered. Hold the ground that turns radar coverage and reaction time into combat power. As the parachutes blossomed, the Navy's operation unfolded underneath them with ruthless precision. Destroyers pushed into screening positions east and west of the transit lanes, spaced to create overlapping missile defense and mutual support. Carrier strike aircraft and land-based fighters stretched the air umbrella higher. Electronic warfare aircraft worked to muddy Iranian targeting data and force missile teams to shoot through noise. Maritime patrol aircraft searched for mine-laying patterns and small boat concentrations. Helicopters skimmed low over the water using speed, angle, and sensor fusion to sort armed contacts from panicked civilian traffic. Everything was built around one requirement: prevent Iran from collapsing the lane in a single coordinated burst. Iran's playbook in Hormuz has never depended on matching the U.S. ship for ship. It depends on compression. Compress the water, compress the warning time, compress the defender's choices until even a superior force starts reacting instead of controlling. Fast inshore attack craft can approach from multiple bearings, hide among neutral traffic, then brake hard and launch rockets, missiles, or one-way explosive boats. Coastal launchers can fire anti-ship cruise missiles from behind rock cover and disappear before impact reports are complete. Drones can force radars and interceptors to spend precious attention on cheap targets while the real strike package closes from a different angle. Naval mines do not need publicity. One damaged tanker is enough to tell the rest of the market the route is no longer safe. The airborne troops were there to crack that compression. High on the ridges and coastal shoulders, overlooking the lanes, small teams dropped into positions where line of sight matters more than mass. They emplaced portable sensors, secured approach roads, and marked suspected launch sites and boat dispersal points. Stinger teams watched for low drones and helicopters. Mortar sections prepared to cut off infiltration routes. Snipers and reconnaissance teams scanned for missile transporters trying to relocate under camouflage netting. Follow-on aircraft started bringing in heavier mobility, ammunition, and command elements once the landing zones were secure. The drop gave U.S. commanders something they never fully have at sea in Hormuz: persistent eyes above the clutter. Then the first engagement began. A tanker convoy moving westbound reported 3 fast contacts closing from the Iranian side. Then 7 more, then more than a dozen. As radar returns split and reformed in the chop, they were small, fast, and using civilian hull patterns to complicate identification until the last possible minute. U.S. helicopters were vectored forward. A destroyer shifted its guns and launched surveillance support from its combat system while aircraft overhead tracked the wider picture. The boats kept coming, fan-shaped, trying to force the convoy to break formation and drift into less certain water. Warning calls went out. Some turned away, others accelerated. The first shots were not dramatic, but they changed the tempo instantly. A helicopter crew identified rocket rails on one of the lead craft and engaged. Seconds later, the convoy's escort opened with naval gunfire designed not to spray the water, but to rip apart the attack geometry. 2 boats disintegrated into white spray and flame. Another spun out and vanished behind wake. The rest scattered exactly as trained, not in retreat, but to force new firing angles. That was the real danger. A swarm is not a single charge. It is a series of questions asked too quickly. Which boat carries rockets? Which one is decoy? Which hull is wired as a suicide craft? Which radar contact is only there to pull your aim away from the missile team on shore? That answer arrived from land. An anti-ship missile launch flashed off a northern island position, low and fast, hugging the clutter line above the water. Aegis picked it up almost immediately, but the geometry was ugly. The missile had not been launched at the destroyer. It was aimed at the slowest, fattest target in the formation, a loaded commercial tanker with limited room to maneuver. The intercept order went out before most of the convoy knew they were in the engagement envelope. One American interceptor climbed, rolled, and drove down toward the threat. A second followed to make sure. The sky over the strait lit for a split second, and fragments rained into the dark sea short of the merchant hull. That should have ended the first wave. Instead, it signaled the main attack. Drones came in low from the northwestern side, timed to arrive as the swarm boats broke contact. Radar operators now had to separate debris, helicopters, civilian traffic, drones, and the possibility of a second cruise missile shot, all while airborne troops on shore reported vehicle movement near two suspected launch roads. A USA, electronic warfare package, pushed, jamming into the sector. Fighters rolled in on coordinates passed from ground observers. Precision weapons struck one launcher position, then a second, collapsing rock and dust across an access track. At nearly the same moment, a coastal observation team reported small boats attempting to move into a cove that offered a perfect hiding place for reloads. Naval aviation answered before they got there. The sea itself was working against everyone. Night haze flattened distances. Heat shimmer above the rocks distorted optics. Merchant captains wanted to turn away from the threat, but in Hormuz, the wrong turn can be as dangerous as the enemy. Move outside the protected lane and you risk collision, grounding, or drifting toward uncleared water. Stay on course and you become predictable. That is why command discipline mattered more than spectacle. The escorts stayed between threat sectors and civilian hulls. Air controllers kept the picture coherent. The airborne force kept feeding corrections from the ground. What looked from a distance like chaos was actually a contest over seconds and bearings. Iran's next move was the oldest one in the Gulf. Mines. Not a massive field, not an obvious blockade, just enough probable emplacement to poison confidence. A patrol aircraft detected unusual patterns from a cluster of small craft that had crossed and recrossed one narrow segment of the lane during the height of the missile exchange. The report went straight through the command net. The objective changed from simple escort to forced continuity. If shipping stopped while commanders argued over whether the contacts were laying mines or merely maneuvering, Tehran would get the result it wanted without firing another missile. The Navy ordered a temporary shift in convoy speed, sent rotary assets to pin the suspected mine layers, and pushed clearance teams and unmanned systems toward the threatened sector. That was the moment the airborne drop proved its value. Ground teams overlooking the approaches identified vehicles linked to the small boat operation and tracked them trying to flee inland. Their coordinates fed into the strike network. One road junction was cut. Another launcher support site was hit before it could disperse. A reconnaissance element on elevated ground reported signal traffic consistent with remote drone control, giving commanders a clearer read on where the attack architecture actually sat. This was not a spontaneous harassment action. It was a deliberate attempt to layer swarm boats, mines, drones, and cruise missiles just long enough to snap commercial confidence and declare the strait effectively unsafe. By dawn, the character of the fight had changed. The Iranian first punch had failed to close the waterway, and that failure mattered. A choke point battle is often decided not by the total damage inflicted, but by whether the attacker can create the perception of unstoppable disruption. The convoy was still moving. Two Iranian attack craft were burning wrecks. A suspected missile site on the islands had gone silent. Several small boats had been destroyed or scattered before they could reload. American commanders now had a clean enough tactical picture to impose order on the next cycle of contact. Clearance operations began immediately because even an uncertain mine report in Hormuz must be treated as real. Helicopters and unmanned systems searched for anomalies in the lane. Explosive ordnance teams prepared for the slow, patient work that no one sees in dramatic footage, but every mariner depends on. Additional warships moved to reinforce the screen. Airborne troops consolidated on the heights, expanded security around landing zones, and turned positions into a sustained surveillance web. The strait was not safe. It was being forced open minute by minute by a combination of sea control air cover, and ground observation that denied Iran the surprise it needed. Strategically, the message cut in two directions. To Tehran, now it was proof that closing Hormuz is far harder than threatening it, because the same geography that empowers ambush also exposes launch corridors, reload routes, and small boat concentrations once a disciplined force seizes the initiative. To Washington and its partners, it was a reminder that naval power in confined waters is never just about ships. In a place this tight, the side that owns the ridgelines, the sensors, and the first verified targeting chain can shape the entire fight. 3,000 parachutes over Hormuz were not theater. They were an attempt to steal back time in a battle where time is the decisive weapon, and that is the part the world often misses. The most dangerous crisis in the Strait does not begin with fleets exchanging broadsides or cities lighting up on television. It begins with doubt. A radar contact that closes too fast, a launcher that moves one valley closer to the sea, a tanker captain who no longer trusts the lane ahead. On that night, the United States answered that doubt with a combined move Iran could not ignore. Troops descending onto the high ground, destroyers locking the water, aircraft cutting the sky into defended sectors, and merchant traffic kept in motion under fire. The immediate crisis ended the only way it ever can in Hormuz, not with total victory, with the passage still open, because in the world's tightest energy choke point, the side that holds the next 6 hours can shake the entire planet.